Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for coming. If you can settle down into your seats, we'll begin the session. I'm delighted to see a strong turnout on a very important subject. I'm not going to bother to introduce any of the participants other than to make just a comment or two. Ellen Johnson Sirleaf is the first woman elected president in Africa. Bill Gates is Bill Gates. Bill Easterly is was at the World Bank for many years, 16 years I think, before he's taken on his current role as a writer and professor. And Paul Wolfowitz has had a long, distinguished career, but it included being ambassador to Indonesia and presumably overseeing U.S. aid programs in some fashion in that place. So let me plunge right into it. Bill Gates, let me ask you. Your foundation has gotten enormous acclaim around the world and has in many ways revolutionized aid giving and health and put it on the map. And what you've done a lot of is things like vaccines. You go into countries, you vaccinate people, some drugs. Now you are moving, it seems to me from the outside, into a more thorny world, a world of in which you will intersect a lot more with the healthcare systems of these countries. Part of that is natural in terms of the continuation of the way in which you're going. Part of it is that a pal of yours gave you a little bit of extra money. And so now you have to spend Warren Buffett's money as well as yours, and you are going into development. Do you think that getting involved in that process, that much more complicated process of the governance structures of these countries, you are still going to be able to find a way to spend money well and effectively compared with a vaccine which is often developed in the Western world, taken over to a place like Africa, you poke a bunch of people's arms, and then you go away?
Well, let me talk about how you have to think of these things. Whenever you invest money, you always wish you could get 100% success rate. And so we can look at any area of activity and say, how common is that? And if you're way below 100%, do your successes, or there's some smash successes that are so good that they outweigh their failures? Coincidentally, the amount of aid the U.S. has given over the last 50 years is very similar to the amount that's been put into venture capital. It's about $500 billion in both cases. And venture capital is, whenever the companies are started, they make various utopian claims about what they'll do, and they're allowed to say those things. Now, 70% of them, it turns out, fail. But we get an eBay, an Amazon, a Google, all these great things, and the net effect for investors, society, we look at those incredible successes. And so in all things related to aid, you get that 70-80% failure rate in venture capital. We shouldn't expect to necessarily do a lot better than that. We actually can do slightly better. But so take our medical work, even before we got into development. We, on malaria, have chosen to back 5 different vaccine approaches. Now, 4 of those, one of those, or 0 or 1 of them will be the best. They could either all fail or one will dominate the others. So at best, 4 of them are a complete waste of money. They're like a steel mill in Nigeria that never does anything. We're also at the same time doing new malaria drugs because we know that the possibility of getting a vaccine quickly is risky enough, and millions are dying a year, that we're investing in these new drugs. And so if we get a vaccine, we know we've wasted essentially all that money, but it's fine. If you just get the new drugs and eventually the vaccine, that's fine. If you get the vaccine earlier, that's even better news. Likewise in AIDS, we're not just investing in a vaccine, we're putting hundreds of millions into treatment, various prevention things. We have trials around a microbicide. The community, including us, has put a lot into circumcision and what that's going to do. And as soon as we get a great vaccine, in a sense, we will have wasted all that money. And so what we have to do is always just look at the successes, the success of vaccination over time. And, you know, if you think about all the things that 500 million U.S. aid did, along with the failures go things like PEPFAR that's saving lives. In fact, if you look at it overall, it's pretty easy to say that the aid as a whole saved at least 100 million lives in that time. And so you can say, okay, that's $23,000 per life if you go to the whole world aid budget over that time, 2.3 trillion, people say. You can say, is it stupid that we saved lives for that much? Well, we spend way more than that to save lives in the rich world. So in a sense, if you say, no, that's too much, we don't want to do it, that's a value judgment that we would disagree with. But I do think people have to understand the successes in terms of the outcomes. And as you say, as we move out of the medical stuff into global development, then we're in microfinance, then we're in agricultural programs. And the ways that you can fail are perhaps even more complex there. But you're talking about improving lives and some things like Green Revolution that touched most of Asia in a very dramatic way. You know, that alone saved tens of millions of lives and reduced population growth and increased nutrition. So it doesn't take too many of those to totally justify all of the risks that we're taking.
But many of those risks, many of the successes you're talking about have a scientific, medical quality to them. And I'm wondering, I'm going to ask Paul Wolfowitz, if you take all the goodwill that Gates and Bono and many governments have produced, and as a result, the debt relief, as a result, increased aid, and if we were to look 5 or 7 years down the road, and what do you think you need to be able to show in outcomes for people to feel like this round of money, this Marshall Plan in Africa, and it will be the 5th Marshall Plan in Africa, succeeded along even the lines that Bill Gates is saying, that there were some sterling successes that justified the total investment?
I think the venture capital model applies to some of the things in the aid area, but not all. And I think one way of illustrating the difference and part of the challenge is to remember that part of that $500 billion in U.S. aid, I guess only at 1% of it, but still $5 billion, went to a man named Mobutu in Zaire. And it wasn't just wasted. I think it helped to destroy a country. And we're now trying to rebuild the consequences of having misused aid to keep a bad government in office and in power and pursuing bad policies. So there's a potential for a high negative return we've seen in the past. And I think for most of our money, we'd like to see something more than a 1 in 10 success rate. We were talking this morning about the very important needs in the area of education. We're looking for ways to be able to invest in education, not with 100% confidence, but with reasonably high confidence. But I would say two things. Number one, I think we have learned a lot over the last 40 or 50 years. We don't do aid the way we used to do it in the past. There's much, much, much more attention, particularly to the issue that is highlighted by the Mobutu example, to the problems of governance. And in fact, in the World Bank now we have, it's kind of complicated, some would say it's overly complicated, but a system for allocating aid according to the performance of countries, so that you don't just put your money in a kind of random bet without knowing who are the good performers. You try to put it on the good performers. Not only the good performers, but basically to reinforce success. And there have been a lot of innovative ways, I think very important ones, of looking at aid delivery, moving more toward decentralization, more toward community-based development, more toward having the real recipients of aid being the ones who are the test of whether it's being received. There are many other new things that I could talk about, but you asked sort of what are we looking for, and I think what will happen in Asia. I mean, East Asia is perhaps the sort of example of what Bill Gates talked about, of the succeed in the fight against poverty. Up until about 25 years, he made the case that success was possible. Now it's absolutely crystal clear. 500 million people have escaped poverty in the last 25 years, most of them in East Asia, and of that, roughly three-quarters in. Some people would say, well, that's all because the East Asian countries adopted these sensible policies of promoting the private sector and competitive export industries. All of that is true, but they didn't do it without an enormous amount of help and support from public sector investment. And I think Korea is an outstanding example. And it's an example, too, of where I think one of the highest return public investments, which is sensible investment in education, has produced arguably the most educated population in the world, with higher college enrollment rates than any country, including the United States. So good governance is essential, but when you have those, resources are essential. You can't do it without investment. And I think that's where development assistance really plays its role. Well, we're going to hear, I hope, from President Johnson Sirleaf. I think in Liberia we have an opportunity now in a country that desperately needs resources, but that has a governance framework in place that can make good use of them. What I would hope is we would start to see in Africa what we saw in East Asia, which is countries that present examples of success, and maybe again there is a venture capital example here, parallel here, that show how it can be done, and in some ways demonstrate to the bad governments and to their people that they're failing. I don't think it's an accident that China finally adopted sensible policies when the Chinese people were able to say to their leaders, we've seen what's going on in Hong Kong, we've seen what's going on in Singapore, we've seen what's going on in Taiwan. Those countries have the same language, the same horrible colonial history. You can't blame all this on the British and the Japanese. There's something wrong with the way we're doing business. And China changed, and it's had an absolutely incredible effect. A lot is happening in Africa today that people don't read about because it doesn't make bad news. But 1/3 of the countries of Africa, with roughly 1/3 of the population, have been growing at 4% or better for 10 years. Now, 4% would look pretty good anywhere in Europe or even in the United States. It's not good enough to really defeat poverty. But I think those 1/3 have a chance to move to a higher level and lead the others to even higher levels. And that's my real hope for success.
Madam President, tell us about take up where Paul Wolfowitz left off. I will note, Paul, that the 14 countries in Africa that you're talking about that grew at over 4%, vast majority of them are because of commodity prices are going through a historic high. How do you get the investment in human resources that Paul Wolfowitz was talking about? Why is it that despite large amounts of aid being given to Africa, that money does not seem to have gone into education in a way that has produced measurable outcomes in terms of the significant rises in literacy or education levels in Africa? There are about 5 big countries that are exceptions to that, I think.
Well, let me start on your premise that there's been a failure in aid. I don't think so. I think...
Can you just press the button? Yeah.
I don't think there's been a failure in aid. Yes, there have been lots of problems, been a lot of white elephants all over the place. But if you look at where we've come from and look at the successes now, countries that are now involved in long-term reconstruction effort as a result of aid, you begin to see that there are successes. Whether we're talking about the success of the immunization program, which the Gates Foundation is doing, whether we're talking about getting it right in Uganda or Rwanda or Mozambique, we're doing it. And sustainability in aid also will relate to sustainability in effort, sustainability in performance. Now, why haven't we been able to channel it into those areas like human resource development, as has been done in Asia and other places? Is because we haven't sat down and got the priorities right. We had a leadership problem in Africa, militarism problem, geopolitical rivalry problems, all of those things that took away from the kinds of consensus that needed to be built. You mentioned something about 5-time Marshall Plan. I don't know about that, because in many cases, the aid has been on a strictly bilateral basis, sometimes for geopolitical interests. Sometimes we have not had to sustain aid to take us to the level where it can sustain itself. Prioritizing have not always taken into account the ownership factor where the greatest needs were. And as a result, in many cases, there have been less than the result that we all anticipated from aid. But I think now you begin to see some sustained effort, you begin to see some successes, and in those cases where the performance is there, where the leadership is moving in the right way, we would like to see much more, a scaling up, in fact, of aid to enable them to get to the place where they can take off. Many of our countries well endowed with natural resources. If only we can get those priorities right, and priorities many times have to be driven at the local level, have to be determined by the people themselves, have to have consensus that enable them to choose. So right now at this point, I think what we need to do is to make sure the aid is focused on those areas where the likelihood of being able to sustain the performance is there and build upon where the successes are.
Okay, I've been playing devil's advocate, but we actually have the devil himself here. Bill Easterly, you've written a book that I suppose could be summarized in one sentence as saying foreign aid is a big waste of money. You convinced by these three powerful sets of arguments?
You know, I think we do have to be brutally honest about the failures in foreign aid, not to give comfort to those who want to eliminate foreign aid altogether, but in order to make foreign aid agencies change so that they do much better in the future than they've done in the past. I like Bill Gates's venture capital metaphor. It's a good metaphor for venture capital because when venture capital is badly invested, the firms go out of business. Well, the sad thing about foreign aid is no aid agencies ever go out of business. The same aid agencies that fail continue operating. You just, Madame President talked about scaling up. What has actually happened in aid has been scaling up the failures as well as the successes. So although it's certainly a valid point that you should expect some failure rate, you need a mechanism to identify when there's a failure and take money away from the failed approaches and redirect it to those approaches that are succeeding. That's what happens in venture capital markets. We have nothing like that in foreign aid. The closest thing we have in foreign aid to that is this is kind of immodest to say it, but aid critics. Aid critics play the role of pointing out when there are failures in the aid agencies, and there are many more besides the one you see in front of you, and hold aid agencies accountable for a record that has really led to extremely disappointing results. To mention another $500 billion figure, $568 billion in today's dollars has gone into Africa over the last 42 years. It was meant to promote economic development and the rise out of poverty in Africa. And over that period of time, there was on average close to zero rise in living standards in Africa. That's failure. And you can torture the data all different kinds of ways, and you still get the same answer, that aid fails to raise economic growth and promote overall economic development. And actually this statistic that Africa has been growing at 4% over the past 10 years, that's good news, and it's certainly good news, but we have to put that in perspective. That 4% is, if you look at a graph, it sort of looks like this. Africa had particularly Francophone Africa, had one of the worst economic depressions in modern economic history up till about 10 years ago. So what we are seeing now is economic growth in the form of recovery from one of the worst economic depressions in history. That's the economic growth. The record on average is zero growth, and that I have to call failure in the hope that that will motivate some kind of change in the aid agencies to do better. Are aid agencies different in the sense of paying more attention to corruption? They certainly say that they are, but it has yet to show up in the data, I have to tell you. All the data is publicly out there on the web. You can do the same calculations that I do in my office. You can just see whether aid received by various countries seems to be sensitive to the degree of corruption or the degree of democracy, if that's what you care is your issue of governance, controlling for some other obvious things like population size and the level of per capita income of the country. And the result is there's no there's no pattern in the data that shows increased sensitivity to corruption. With data that runs up through 2004. There's absolutely no trend towards increased sensitivity by donors to corruption. The story that donors now are, enormously aware of corruption and are taking money away from the corrupt countries and giving it to the less corrupt countries, I'm sorry, it's just not in the data. And that's the kind of truth that has to be told if we are going to force change in donor agencies' behavior so that the next $568 billion in aid to Africa, I hope that it is spent, that there is another $568 billion in aid to Africa, but it does have much better chance of reaching the poor than the first round did.
Bill, you're shaking your head vigorously.
Well, you don't really eat GDP. It's not an outcome. I mean, if you work at the World Bank, maybe it is. But when we put people on AIDS drugs, we don't say to them, hey, unless you raise the GDP, we have wasted our money. I mean, I am sorry. This is bad. We have saved 1 million lives here, and the GDP didn't go up. If you look at literacy rates in Africa, the increase, literacy rates are tripled over that time period. Look at maternal mortality. Look at infant mortality. Take what happened over these last 40 years. And yes, they're taking Africa, which of all the places aid was given to, on average, is the worst place. So they're taking it's a biased selection sample.
And tripling is not very high in literacy because there have been tripling is not actually that high. Yeah, you've had six-fold rises.
It's not
in
a very high
everywhere
percentage
else,
of the aid because this aid number includes a lot of phantom stuff in it. It includes accumulating interest on a debt that never would be paid and forgiving that. It's a complete phantom. That's a huge percentage of those figures. The stuff that's actually spent on vaccinations, no, I don't promise that when that child lives, it will cause a GMP increase. I don't promise that. I think life has value. And when the World Bank wrote a report that, AIDS actually could hurt somebody's GMP, is that really how they think of AIDS? My God, is that really what it does? It hurts GMP? It's only a little bit, though. It's only 1%. It's not that bad. You don't have to feel bad about it. But people who think about death, this is a serious problem. And that's what we're trying to prevent. That is an outcome. That is worth measuring. What happened with smallpox, that was aid at work. And are we at the same place as we were 40 years ago on smallpox? No, we're not.
Can I just come right back?
No. I want to. Nobody's paying for these microphones, but I have control. Paul, do you want to get a quick bite at this apple?
Well, I certainly agree that saving lives is in itself something important. And I think, again, you can't take the record of 40 years and say because there's a lot of failure in it, therefore what we're doing is wrong, as though we didn't learn any lessons from what's been done in the past, as though nothing has improved and nothing's changed. I mean, I don't know how Bill wants to calculate this correlation between aid and corruption. I know an enormous effort is going in right now into trying to look at performance-based allocation of assistance. And you've got to take the whole picture. I mean, look at East Asia. Look at the $40 billion that went into China. Just World Bank. I don't know. If you look at all the donors together, it's probably between 100 and 200 billion. Look at the 25 billion of World Bank and much, much more from others that went into Korea. We know when aid doesn't work. I think we know when it does work. And I would agree with Bill Gates also. There are times, or there are types of things you can do, types of interventions that hopefully can work even in the absence of good governance. But the real goal is to get the poor countries onto the track that's been demonstrated repeatedly now as a success. And you can't say it's just Singapore and Hong Kong anymore. You can't say it's just East Asians. The Indians are starting to do it. And the Indians, very much inspired by the Chinese. We had a discussion with some Indian policymakers. They said the good performing states in India are setting an example for the poor performing ones. And I will not forget meeting with a peasant woman in Pakistan and asked her about whether success was possible in Pakistan. She said, why not? The Japanese have done it. The Chinese have done it. Why can't Pakistan do it? I think this opportunity to succeed by following the examples of others is a very real possibility. And it's not just commodity prices, by the way. You don't do 10 years 4% isn't good enough to make the real dent. I agree with that. But 4% is a positive performance, and I think we know some of the things that can get them up to higher levels.
Madam President, do you want to quickly add something before we go on?
Let me quickly add to that. To just say, admittedly, there's been a problem with corruption, and that has taken away from some of the aid effect. We've seen statistics that show that some of the funds salted away, in banks by foreign leaders could very well solve our debt problem, and we're conscious of that problem and what it means. But let me just use the example that Bill talked about when he talked about interest. In the case of Liberia, for example, we're trying to grapple today with a $750 million debt to the IMF, where what makes up that debt? That debt comes from a $250 million standby credit to a military regime. 250 to 750 is just accumulated interest. Is that part of the 500 billion that is referred to? Can we really call that aid? And can we call that aid that did not get the desired result? I mean, those are the kinds of issues that we've got to be very mindful of when we begin to make the blanket statements about these failures. Sure.
Of course, a lot of the aid to South Korea was also military aid. So in a way, you're counting. But I want to move on and ask about another aid critic and get at the subject that, Bill, your foundation is most proud of. I think justifiably. Lead story in Foreign Affairs this week. This issue is "Do No Harm." Laurie Garrett on why the funding boom for healthcare in the developing world may make things worse, not better. And she basically argues that there is going to be too much emphasis on sexy diseases, vaccines, one-shot approaches, and that the core healthcare infrastructure in badly governed countries will atrophy further and further, and that the long-term healthcare prospects are actually going to get worse as a result. What do you make of that?
Well, I'm thrilled that these diseases have become sexy. I mean, visceral leishmaniasis. Wow. I mean, this is cool stuff, and I think that's an improvement. It is interesting that when there's an advance, like take the Green Revolution, which in terms of nutrition levels and lives saved and reducing population growth was this incredible thing. Most of what you'll read about it, go back and read the articles written about it, were about problems. And there were problems. They used too much fertilizers in some places. They messed up the smallholders by not working with them in some places. But that was at the 10% level. What it did overall was it is the home run hit of the aid parade, either vaccination or Green Revolution. It's hard to compare the two. That yes, we can be more efficient, but they mean that American who's thinking about saving this $40 a year of deep generosity that has gone to aid, it should be paid. If the aid wasn't there, those things would not have happened. So there's always a focus on the problems. That's okay as long as people don't lose perspective that Green Revolution avoided a Malthusian result, which would have been disastrous because you get a very negative cycle there. So when Laurie writes about this, first of all, we fund health systems. The latest book that's really good on this is the Disease Control Prevention in Developing Countries. And it talks about how you design a health system and how you use it across the different diseases. And if you want to see this in action, you should go to a Paul Farmer Global Fund site and see how he takes AIDS money and makes a commitment to save lives, which as he should, but he uses it for horizontal infrastructure. And that's happening everywhere. Gavi creates infrastructure to deliver vaccines. And believe me, when and if, which is hopefully when, we get a malaria vaccine, the benefit of the money we put into that vaccination system is what will allow us to get that out there. And the burden you'll take away from the classic health system when you don't have kids coming in with cerebral malaria is quite dramatic. Likewise, if you get a TB vaccine or an AIDS vaccine. So this is a primary infrastructure that is being invested in by the government supporting Gavi and ourselves at a record level. And the type of understanding of health systems, how to do it in developing countries, we invested in this research that led to the DCP thing. So the idea of health systems, absolutely, that's an important thing. It doesn't mean that when you go in to do AIDS treatment, you don't need to do some special things. The work we did in Botswana was a mix where sometimes we did special sites for AIDS treatment because it's so endemic in the country, and sometimes we integrated in with the health system. So there can't be a religion that, oh, people are dying, you have to do it through the normal health system. You have to think about the cost benefit. But there's certainly an awareness of those things, and it's an area of importance. But the vaccine infrastructure is better today than ever.
You mentioned malaria, Paul. I know this is something you were focused on and are interested in. I wanted to ask you whether you think it is possible to be more aggressive given the widespread prevalence until we get a Bill Gates funded vaccine, because I look at millions and millions of cases of malaria, and there's this use of bed nets, and there's we're gingerly getting back to using DDT and things like that. But malaria had basically been eradicated. I think you were down in Sri Lanka to, I forget how many cases before the backlash against DDT. Is there a case to be made to say, very frankly, that look, we have to use much more of this stuff that has certain toxic aspects in order to really eradicate malaria? Or is the current approach of using bed nets and trying to educate people about when do we go under them going to be enough?
Well, I think the current approach isn't just bed nets. The current approach is really bed nets plus spraying plus artemisinin-based treatment. And I think you really need all three. And I think malaria in Africa is a tougher version, and climatically, and the vector's different, the parasite is different. So, and even when you get it suppressed significantly, you've got to keep working at it to keep it down. But I think there are proven successes. The joint project of Mozambique and South Africa and Swaziland with several major companies running a big aluminum smelter in Mozambique has brought malaria occurrence down by 94-95%. So I think we know, and it's not overly complicated. In many ways, it's much less complicated, I think, than AIDS and some other diseases. It's been a kind of orphan disease, if that's the right word for it, because Western countries don't worry about it, don't suffer from it. Maybe there'd be a vaccine by now if we hadn't eradicated it. And even in the African countries, it's more a disease of children than of adults, or at least the mortality is among children. But the mortality among children is incredible. It's roughly 3,000 people a day, and 3,000 is a certain significance if you think back 5 years in New York City. It really is something that we can do something about, we must do something about, and I agree also that if we work on malaria, we're going to improve the health system as a whole. You can't do it without it, and you will leave a better health system when you're done. And a health system, Bill correctly said, that isn't burdened by the 15 or 20% tax that treating malaria patients imposes on it today.
All right, let me open it up to questions from the floor. Please remember, identify yourselves, and it really has to be a question. I will not act, I'm going to move on to the next person if it isn't a question. Ma'am.
My name is Ivor Ong, and I'm an anthropologist from Wolfowitz and a friend of Paul Clark. So I want to say that I have great admiration for, the Gates Foundation and similar foundations for all the great good that they have achieved in Africa and elsewhere. So this question is shouldn't be taken as a criticism, but in fact a desire for clarification. When non-state actors and even individuals play a role in setting up governance structures in a country, what are the political implications of that?
Let me ask Madam President, when you have foreign agencies, aid agencies, or NGOs coming in and setting up healthcare delivery systems, is that an infringement on your sovereignty? Should it be regarded as such?
There are times when it can be an infringement and intrusion, and that's when the priorities and the goals are set by the NGOs or by these external groups without due recognition to the country's own priorities. When that happens, we don't have the kind of harmonization, we have a lack of coordination, and we have people going in different directions and thereby undermining the chances of success in achieving the objectives. And this is why much effort is being put now into making sure that we do have a coordinated approach, that we do form the partnerships in which state actors can work with non-state actors to make sure that they do follow the priorities of the country, that development agenda with clear goals, with careful planning, with strategic thinking are all part of the same program. Otherwise, then the effect is undermined.
Bill Easterly, you call your book White Man's Burden. Do you worry about this sort of the neo-imperialism of foreign aid?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's part of the curse of having the goal of aid being to transform a whole nother society, which is really what its sort of general aspiration has been. That's what development means, is the attempt to transform a whole nother society. Inevitably involves a kind of patronizing approach to the people in that society, that we know more about your problems than you do. And so that is what has led to this huge amount of conditions that are placed on aid loans, which is really us telling you what to do, which is incredibly patronizing. And now it's the conflict has only just been barely papered over by a diplomatic change in language, that now we are talking more about country ownership, which is actually not a new idea. It's been around for decades and decades. But country ownership, if you read the documents carefully, seems to be something like, you voluntarily choose to do what we tell you to do. And that's, to speak honestly, not a great improvement.
Can we get a mic here?
Thank you. Seth Berkley. I run the International AIDS Vaccine Initiative. There's been an extraordinary change. Bill Gates talked about it. He's responsible for a lot of it. People are paying attention now to these diseases. AIDS, 10 years ago, AIDS in Africa, people didn't know about it. Now every political leader, every rock star, it's really become a big deal. However, the world has set up a goal that is unsustainable. By 2010, we're going to put everybody on treatment. We're going to have prevention. We're going to do that. And if you really work out the economics, particularly with resistance, it's not going to work. We need new tools. We thank the Gates Foundation. They're very good to us. However, what is the system for creating new tools over the long term? If you go to a country and you say, should Liberia borrow to make an AIDS vaccine, a malaria vaccine, or whatever, the answer is of course not, because it's a global public good. The bank doesn't fund that type of research, and bilateral agencies don't. So how do we set up a system in the future that is going to look at global public goods financing for not only the diseases of today, but of tomorrow as well, besides the Gates Foundation, which is one of the leaders in it?
Bill, you want to write some more checks?
Well, the amount of money the world spends on biological research, which actually creates these opportunities, is quite vast. U.S. taxpayers, $30 billion a year. That is about things that will create the tools. What's going on now in terms of diagnostic techniques, genetic measurement techniques, all of those will address these diseases that we care about. So that is full speed ahead, accelerating innovation. NIH, put their name up. No, they don't take it the last mile, but the first 9 miles that really count, that's why we can come in and say, okay, immunology is better understood. Also, rich world markets are very effective things at creating a demand for a pneumococcal vaccine, a rotavirus vaccine. Very effective. It doesn't always work, but remember, a lot of the disease burden out there actually still is in common with the rich world. If you move away from infectious, you get about an 80% overlap. And so as long as we understand differential pricing and can do those things right, then for those things, it's really fantastic. For that extra 20%, you do have a recognition that people have to step up. Most of the things in that 20%, we and others are now on the case and doing those things. I feel very good that those things will be solved. It gets easier as the science moves along. If we tried to do an AIDS vaccine or a malaria vaccine 30 years ago. I don't care, how much money we put into it. It's unlikely that we would have been successful.
Seth, how close are we to an AIDS vaccine?
It's interesting. There will be a vaccine that is going to, results are going to be broken in about 18 months from Merck, which is the lead candidate. We don't know whether that's going to work or not. Most people don't think it's going to be 100% effective, but it may work. So we may have a candidate that has efficacy at that point. If it works partially, it'll give us critical clues. There's a lot of other good candidates that are that type of vaccine behind it. On the other hand, if it doesn't work at all, I worry enormously about the field keeping on. I know the Gates Foundation will, but keeping the rest of the field on and keeping engaged in it. And, for me, it's important to think about the systems because I know the Gates Foundation is there, but I'd like to see a world where, politicians and others not only thought about the short term, but the long term. The goal is to end AIDS. The goal is to end malaria. The goal is, to end, pandemic flu if it appears, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's that long-term system that I worry about that we make sure exists.
I just want to add to that. Sure. If you look at India, India's our best case because medical science there is advancing very quickly, and they have virtually all the diseases. And so the opportunity of China and India to make contributions in there is they will fill, people like Serum Institute are thinking very radical ideas about how to do these things. So that the gap, time is on our side.
Yeah, sir.
Henry Markram, the Swiss Federal Institute for Technology. It's clearly, my question relates to supporting research, expertise, and intellectual property within the countries that are receiving aid. It's clearly very important to support immediately what has to be done to save lives. And I'm sure that there are a lot of initiatives for very long term. But unless there's a significant component of support for research so that the countries that are receiving aid are able to administer their own aid in the next 10 years, then it seems like this is an endless aid channel. So the question is, to what extent do the aid programs link the amount of aid given also to support the research to make these countries independently capable of sustaining their own problems?
Paul, is that something the World Bank does currently?
I don't. At the risk of sounding like I'm defending GDP, I think that is where you get the sustainability from. I don't think. I do think more could be done to invest in sort of basic, more applied science and applied research in developing countries. And I think one of the problems with the $500 billion is way too much of it went to paying for rather expensive Western consultants who may or may not have done any good in the countries they went to. So that, if that's what you're talking about, I would agree with you. But in terms of basic research, I think it's not likely to be done, even recognizing that there are specific needs of those countries. What they do need, and India, China are terrific examples. Once you get enough growth, you begin to have the resources to do things that no one else will do, but they're with your own resources.
No, so one question per person. Madam President, can you address this? Because India and China are unusual in that even though they were very poor countries, they had at the very highest level very high quality science institutes. Would there be recipients for funding of serious research all around the world?
That's precisely what's needed when you talk about financing global public goods. That's one area in Africa where you could do it, scientific research in agriculture. That will lead us on the path to the Green Revolution. That's how Asia did it, and that's exactly what we need. And I hope that, now that Paul said, I hope that we'll get more of that kind of financing from the World Bank and from other institutions.
And by the way, on ag research, there is a mechanism. It's called a CGIR. And I don't know if I have a feeling it's not as applicable in other fields, but it's spectacular for agriculture.
Yeah, and that's in developing countries. That's
ma'am in the front row there. I'm trying to
It's hard to develop an improved strain of cassava in California. You're much better doing it in Africa.
One thing. I'm going to make a short statement. Melinda Gates. One of the things that we are doing in agriculture, what we just announced with the Rockefeller Foundation 4 months ago, is all work in Africa. AGRA is put in Africa for exactly that reason. We're going to graduate 70 new people who have their Masters of Science in crop breeding and 50 new PhDs in crop breeding in Africa. They're going to deliver their own crops, their own type of new seeds. We're setting up agro dealers in Africa who understand their own small farm plots. So that's the whole idea behind the Green Revolution that we're trying to bring to Africa.
Let me see. Sir at the back there.
Simon Maxwell. I run the Overseas Development Institute in London. I was thrilled to hear Bill Easterly say that we should have another $500 billion in aid. I hope someone has written that down, carved it in stone at the end of the meeting. The question is, what are we going to spend it on? The Africa Commission, when it reported exactly 2 years ago, said maybe we've overemphasized primary health, primary education, and the Millennium Development Goals and neglected the investment in infrastructure and in growth that are going to reduce poverty in the long term. My question is, how do we get the balance right? Should Bill build bridges? And should Melinda make, and I can't think of something that rhymes alliteratively with M, but perhaps other people can. How do we spend this money, and do the foundations have a role that is different to the one they're currently playing?
Let me collect a couple, because ma'am in the front row, just so that we get, there seems to be a lot of questions here, and I want people to feel like they've gotten a chance.
Thank you. I'm from Portugal, from a foundation, Gulbenkian Foundation. We have a long experience in aid to development in some countries, Lusophone countries in Africa. And I was hearing some things that Yvette said, and I have a question, and after I have a question for the other members of the panel. One question: what is the solution for a country that, like for instance now, Guinea, that Minister of Health is waiting for the money of the African Bank of Development and needs that foundation, for instance, gives support for the counterpart, for the other part to deliver the money. And of course there is no good governance, there is not good conditions, but there are people dying and children dying. What would be your response if you were in a position like mine, a foundation that has responsibles and a mission on that? Second question that I would like to say is that I fully agree with people that said that what you need really with lessons that all had took during these years, World Bank, all the other institutions, and now with the examples of philanthropy, the new philanthropy, let's call it like that, that capacity building in the countries is absolutely crucial, and cannot give aid like that. You have in a long-term proposal of development to give the ways, and this is the fight against illiteracy, and of course to support research and own capacity. But my question in this moment is the following.
Wait, that's your
global,
third.
Global.
No, ma'am. I think you've had two. How about we stop at two?
Global compromises on millennium goals.
Okay.
It will be or not put away ahead. Out, because now the priority is on climate change.
Okay, I got it. Let me actually take that third one and ask you, Bill and Paul, do you think that climate change intersects with your goals in a way? For you look at malaria. If the Earth's temperature rises by a degree or two, presumably you're going to have a fairly significant expansion of the problem of malaria. Or is that not? Should we not be? Does climate change intersect with the problems we're talking about?
Not really. If you're a total pessimist and you don't think we're going to have a malaria vaccine by 2100, then wow, The amount of shifting of where the mosquitoes are and things like that, that's not the big issue. The big issue is getting the vaccine.
Paul?
Climate change does intersect with problems of agriculture, for example. I mean, I think
And water, for example.
and water availability. So, and some large percentage of the projects that we've invested in over the last 20, 30 years are going to be probably significantly impacted by climate change. So I think that says that there is a significant impact on poor countries. But there is, there's so many important things that need to be done. The question about should somebody build bridges? I think, of course, someone should build bridges. Someone also needs to develop vaccines. Someone needs to work on agriculture. And I think there is a need for more resources for development. Both from a point of view of self-interest and from a moral point of view, that what we're getting by with these days is really pretty stingy.
Bill Easterly, if you were czar, and if you were not an aid critic, what would you do? Stop criticizing and tell us what would be, very briefly, how would you deliver aid?
It's sort of like asking Paris Hilton to give advice on abstinence. But well, I can't step away from being an aid critic. I think the answer to your question is, what brings long-run development is always homegrown. It's not brought by outsiders with their superior experts and all their outside money bringing economic development. That's what the record of history tells us. President Wolfowitz's example of China succeeding, well, China gets all of 0.5%, less than 0.5% of its GDP in aid. And it's homegrown development. As people move towards free markets, as China did, income rises. And, sorry, Bill, you can eat GDP. You can use your higher income to spend on food, and then you eat the food.
Not if you're not alive, you can't, it turns out.
Well, you've done a good job keeping them alive, and
well, you're trying to stop it, though.
No. You're doing great on health. It's just the GDP part that is not working. The reason 50% of children in Ethiopia are malnourished is because Ethiopians have the lowest per capita GDP in the world. So you cannot ignore per capita GDP.
All right, let's get maybe one or two. Lady there in the middle, yeah.
Tool. I don't know.
Thank you. I just, Hina Rabbani, I manage Minister for International Development, Government of Pakistan, and therefore manage all the aid that is coming to Pakistan. Now, I have a quick question. I think the question more than where is as to how the aid which is going to be coming in the future is going to be used. And here I haven't seen the word Paris Declaration on Aid Effectiveness, which I feel is one of the most important documents mentioned at all, which talks about strengthening systems that already exist rather than making new ones. And I feel there's a choice between immediacy and sustainability. And sustainability demands that one way or the other, you work with systems, you try and strengthen them. And by no means, Mr. Gates, am I undermining your job. You've done an excellent, innovative work there. But I'm talking about bilateral, multilateral assistance that is coming into countries. How willing are we to actually operationalize the Paris Declaration, because so far that hasn't been done.
Okay, wonderful. And let's get somebody else. Sir, at the back there.
My name is Jeffrey Kent. I was born in Africa and I started my business in Africa. I must say, sitting here...
No. Question. What is your question?
My question is, I think Africa doesn't need a handout. I'm really referring to Mr. Easton. It needs more of a handout. There are so many subsidies in Europe and the United States in agriculture. The travel warnings on tourism to Ethiopia, for instance, but nobody dares to go there. Africa doesn't have a chance. I think we need, my question is, you've studied in the West the subsidies that are given by the United States and in Europe to give Africa more of a chance to compete on a natural system.
Madam President, if you had to choose between aid or trade, which would you choose?
There's no doubt that we want to see us move toward trade. We want to be able to finance our own development from our natural resources. And the way to do it is not to only talk about free markets, but to live it. To walk the talk, so to speak. And that means cutting the subsidy, allowing our cotton exports to get into it and to get a fair price and enable us to carry the burden of our development much more so from the basis of our own resources. But, to do that sometimes you may have to have the short-term support through aid, but the aid should have a very clear focus leading toward enabling us to move to the trade nexus where we can move away from the dependency from aid over time and be able to finance our own development.
I'm going to ask the last question to Paul Wolfowitz. Paul, you've made fighting corruption one of the signature aspects of your tenure at the World Bank. The World Corruption Index currently has recently released its rankings. The country at the bottom of the rankings is Iraq. What lesson do you draw from the levels of corruption in Iraq?
That they've got a lot of work to do, and I think the best of them understand that. Their biggest problem is actually how to manage the money they have, not how to get... I mean, they need aid, but they most of all need to learn how to manage their own money. It is a fact that some countries, China's one, have managed to do fairly well in spite of fairly high levels of corruption, but I think it's also significant that China's done a lot of work to improve governance and improve accountability, and they recognize that as a problem. I have no question that the trade agenda is an absolutely critical one, and we put a lot of work in the bank in advocacy and analyzing and advertising what's going on here. $260 billion, let me repeat that. That's, in 1 year, $260 billion, roughly half of that from Europe, the other half from the U.S. and Japan, is paid by consumers or taxpayers to subsidize agriculture in the rich countries, very much at the expense of the poor ones. Cotton's a particular scandal. That's an American scandal. The U.S. spends $5 billion a year to subsidize 20,000 cotton farmers. You can figure out how many poor farmers if you just divide $5 billion by 20,000. That's an incredible taxpayer benefit that costs poor African cotton farmers enormously. I'm getting a little discouraged about the Doha round, but I still think there's a chance for some success, and I think it's really critical. But whatever happens in Doha, I think we need to work further and harder, and I think we need to look at some kind of trade regime that gives some special benefits for the poorest countries.
I think we'll end on that note because I noticed agreement, and I just want to underscore Paul's point, which is this is a win-win trade because it frees up resources in the developing world, and it frees producers it frees up resources in the developed world, and it frees up producers in the developing world to sell their product. The problem is politics, but you all can make a difference there if you are more vocal about the need to change that. Thank you all very much.